Just going to give it a few seconds for everyone to join. Okay, shall we get going, Neil? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, great. Welcome everyone to our journal club. We're so thrilled that you've managed to make time in your busy day. As we wait for more people to join, why don't you just throw in the chat for us, are you a coach, ? Joining, what's made you join, and where are you dialing in from? It will be lovely to see the shape of this audience. I'm Coach Hilton. Okay, let me get going with the intros while we're getting that sorted out in the chat. Elaine, you can also keep track of the chat for us and let us know if there's anything urgent there we need to attend to. So just for the sake of legalities, I am obliged to let you know we're recording, and I hope you're comfortable with that. David, our marketing manager, will make the recording available after the session. And I think we can get going. So today's session is really set to challenge a few assumptions and spark some great conversations. Joe, as our coach supervisor and very steeped in all of these practices that we have in coaching, will also know that sometimes what we do in practice is not really what we taught in theory. So our topic today is, what do coaches really do in practice, and does that work? New research shows that many coaches are quietly breaking the rules, not in a careless way, but stepping outside of what they were taught in training and in accreditation, and for many people it's working. Dennis, that's amazing to see you. Which raises the question, should coaching theory catch up with what's really happening in practice? Now, to explore this, we're so excited. Neil Bierbaum has joined. He's a longtime friend of Omnicor, and in fact, one of our appointed coaches on our Omnicor panel, and I see quite a few of our other coaches attending. Neil's background is that of a leadership coach, a team coach, and he has more than 20 years experience, a master's graduate from the Stellenbosch Business School, and a coach trainer who blends academic rigor with real-world practicality. He writes the Mindset newsletter and runs a YouTube channel, and is known for making research accessible, engaging, and occasionally a little rebellious. Neil will take us through the findings of his recent research, and after that we'll open the floor for questions. Elaine, my colleague, will be managing the chat. We are all on mute, or well, we will be on mute, and she will keep an eye out for any of your questions, comments. So please feel free to engage and to provide your questions for Neil, and he will take and answer all of them, as many as he can, once he's done his presentation. And we're excited to get going. Over to you, Neil.
Great, thanks, Colleen, and thank you for setting this up and inviting me. It's always a privilege and an honor to be on the Omnicor panel, and I always say the best run panel in the country, and really a privilege to be here, and the fact that we do these kind of exercises, which enriches our experience and knowledge. And so just a little context from my side in terms of how this came about, this research. So I, as Colleen said, began coaching about 20 years ago, learned it more as a craft through one of the traditional coach training schools, and then obviously did various CCEU programs and professional development programs along the way. And then kind of wanted the bigger picture of where the training I had fitted in within coaching, also the academic qualification, and particularly the academic method. Before I did this, having learned coaching the way I did, I used to struggle reading coaching material, right? Coaching papers, coaching books. I would kind of glaze over. For me, it had been learned very practically. So I had to get into that discipline, and the M4 program at Stellenbosch was really useful in doing that. And so this is the research that I did as part of our thesis or research assignment. And the title, as you can see, is How and Why Executive Coaches Use a More Directive Approach When Coaching. And I think it goes to the heart of what coaching is and really challenges some of the core assumptions around coaching. And just to put that into context, let me activate that. To present and define what that facilitative versus directive approach is. So facilitative approach means that the coach acts as a thinking partner who asks questions, but refrains from making suggestions or leading the process in any way. And anybody who's been exposed to coaching in any way knows that that's fundamentally what you get taught from day one of coaching. And, you know, that the coach is not the expert and asks questions, does not lead. And the accepted wisdom among coaches has been that this is coaching's key success factor, is its facilitative or non-directive approach. And there's a reason why that arose, and not always the one that we think it is. So firstly, it's attributed, and this has kind of come out of my academic research, it's attributed firstly to coaching's roots in humanistic psychology. So the format of coaching, where people are sitting one-on-one in a room talking to each other in a confidential environment, originates its format and structure from humanistic psychology. And then the other important piece as well was ironically, coaching's efforts to distinguish itself from psychology, counseling, consulting, and mentoring. And that's probably the first thing you get taught in coaching, is that, you know, we're different from those, and part of the ICF ethics, requirement is that you always state, you know, what coaching is and is not. And so there's a strong emphasis on what makes coaching different. However, is that the same thing as what makes coaching effective? And that's the one big assumption that we have in coaching, which, funny enough, as coaches who challenge people's assumptions, I don't believe we really challenge that assumption enough ourselves. And another irony that arises out of that is that coaching assumes that the client is whole and resourceful. But the one thing that the resourceful client can't do is use the coach as a resource. So the client can't ask the coach, well, what do you think? And we know why. However, there is a case for sometimes being available to that. And that's really what this research answers is, does that happen? Is it necessary? Is it effective? And how does that relate to the theoretical frameworks that are out there for what makes effective conversations, like a coaching conversation? And so that's what I'll be presenting today, is attempting to answer that question in some way. I guess one of the things I need to do is acknowledge my own possible personal biases, which is important in the academic context, I recognize. And so firstly, I was trained in the ontological tradition, which it'll come up again during the presentation. Ontological coaching is specifically trains what are called linguistic distinctions, which is you introduce a distinction to the client, which helps them gain an awareness. And so it's a directive approach. And when you get your ontological training, they say, this is how we do it, but you can't do this for your ICF accreditation. And so you learn that distinction from the beginning. And then you go into practice. And in my practice, I would say I've always found that it's useful to share frameworks and tools and things with clients, especially with leaders, even senior leaders. Often they haven't been exposed to a communication framework that can be useful for them. And so they get stuck, and that is helpful to them. So that's been my journey. I also then, a short while ago, started the ISCF MCC, Master Certified Coach application process, and found that to be quite frustrating. And that set up some of my interest in this and trying to answer the questions I was experiencing then. I'll mention that again, but I'll try to keep my own biases out of it. So that's just some context for how this came about and some definition around that. So the formal research purpose statement was to explore how and why executive coaches might be using a more directive approach when working with leaders in the organizational coaching context. And to be formal and academic about it, the 3 research objectives were to explore which directive approaches coaches were using across their practice, how they were applying them, and the reasons why they were applying them. So those are the 3 research objectives, and I'll present the findings according to that. So it was important in beginning this examination, we had to recognize that firstly, there's no unifying theoretical framework for coaching. It's kind of evolved. It's a very eclectic process, and everybody knows this. It involves many different inputs, and people who become coaches come from all sorts of different backgrounds, different education, different, education and skills backgrounds, and then they go through many different coach training backgrounds. So that, while that's appropriate for the kind of demands that coaching has, it also creates a challenge for evaluating coaches and, when making coach purchasing decisions from an organization perspective. And so the accreditation bodies arose out of that, and they leaned strongly into this facilitative approach. And so the training schools aligned with that, and it kind of created its own momentum. But the bottom line is there's no foundational framework. So we had to go and look, in doing this research, what would be are there any theoretical frameworks we can reference for adult learning and the coaching process? And coaching is strongly mapped to the adult learning process, Kolb's learning cycle. So we found this one, which was by Heron, and he had put forward 6 categories of intervention for what we've called supportive practitioner-client relationships. So the original book by Heron was written in 1976, and it was called Helping the Client. And everybody who knows coaching will know that helping is like anathema to coaching. You never help. However, and his book was written in response to observing experienced general practitioners train junior or new general practitioners. And then he took that learning process and he extrapolated and he built this model, and he described what it could be applied for, these supportive practitioner-client relationships. Coaching wasn't a thing back then, but what he described, exactly matches what coaching is, what coaching has become. And so it's completely relevant to have a look at these 6 categories, and other people have used them in the coaching research area as well. So the 6 categories that he defined, 3 were facilitative, there's that word, non-directive, and those are cathartic, catalytic, and supportive. We'll define them in a minute. And the other 3 were authoritative or directive, prescribing, informing, and confronting. So immediately interesting, he was saying that we need both. We need the non-directive and we need the directive, and ultimately you need to be moving between them. Coaching leans heavily towards the one on the left, and so our debate is the one on the right, the directive. And just to give those some definition, so we can see there the facilitative categories. So cathartic seeks to enable the client to release or abreact painful emotion. Catalytic seeks to elicit self-directed living, learning, or problem solving. So we know that, that's what the questioning, we're always trying to get the client to take responsibility and solve their problems and take action. Supportive seeks to affirm the worth and value of the client's persona, qualities, attitudes, actions. And that's in coaching, not so much explicit, it's more by understanding and working with their language model, their frameworks, and aligning with that, rather than going, yes, good, great. That kind of affirming is very much discouraged within coaching. It's much more around affirming their thinking style and then working with that thinking style. Then we get to the authoritative ones, which is there's confronting. So seeks to raise clients' awareness about limiting attitude or behavior. Interestingly, that one within that is the practice of challenging, which we'll see is very much an accepted coaching practice. Unpack that more in a minute. Prescribing seeks to direct client thinking or behavior, and then informing seeks to impart knowledge, information, or meaning to the client. So that's the definition. And just as a quick mention, on my MCC journey, what I noticed was that the MCC process is about leaning deep into that left-hand side. They want you to release or abreact emotion almost every time. To elicit self-directed learning, believes very strongly into that. And I was quite challenged when I did the MCC course that it sounded almost like person-centered therapy that people were doing rather than coaching, the way that it was being practiced. And so I had a big journey and a challenge with that. I won't go into that in too much detail, but definitely I got the experience firsthand that coaching leans so strongly into that left-hand side columns, those 3 columns. So then this was advanced then by Eric de Haan and Victor Nilsson. So de Haan is the leading researcher in world coaching, I would say. He's the most prolific, does a lot of quantitative studies. He's just released a big study now that is similarly aligned to this and has been doing so for quite a number of years. And so he took Heron's model and advanced it, and he kind of rearranged it so it looks like that. And he put it onto 2 different axes, which he called a dominance and an appreciation axis. So the one is the authoritative, that directive style, which he called the push side of the dominance continuum. And those 3 we see, the confronting, prescribing, and informing. And then the others, he renamed 2 of them and moved them into that position. We don't need to go into any detail on this. The main thing is to emphasize that the Heron's model was brought into coaching by de Haan, and he continued to recognize prescribing, informing, and confronting, even though it's not accepted within coaching. And they did so because, firstly, from a theoretical point of view, and secondly, because it hasn't been proved that it's not effective in coaching. And so they wanted to examine that and test that and allow for that. And another interesting piece within this was that they had previously made findings. Before this study, they had done another study, which they then mentioned and tested within this one, was that coaching clients found value in receiving information or input from the coach as long as they had permission or the freedom to accept it and whether to work with it or not. And that echoed an even earlier study with therapists and clients. So this thing around autonomy and freedom to choose whether to work with the input was seen as key for coaching effectiveness. And so de Haan and Heron both felt that one needs to be able to move through all of these, and the key thing is this piece around the coach having self-determination or agency, the coachee, sorry. So that takes us then to having a look at what does the literature say, and what are the current levels of debate within these 3 categories. So this is part of the academic process, is doing a literature review, and what we found was that in prescribing, there's little to no question that within coaching that the agency should sit with the coachee and not with the coach. So in other words, the coachee, I'm using that term, client, determines what should happen in a session, determines the pace of the session, so the coach is very much about, what shall we work on today? Shall we take it in this direction or that? And the literature showed that there's high conformity with that and little evidence of much debate. So we can say that prescribing is not done, gets the red cross, and that the temperature of the debate is very low. The next category is confronting. So we find that confronting includes challenging, which is an ICF core competence. So challenging the client is kind of coaching's secret sauce in a way. So it is widely accepted within coaching. It's not debated much at all, same as prescribing is not debated. And as I said, is often seen as coaching's key ingredient. And there's evidence as well from Blanche, who found that there was positive learning value gained from coaches challenging. And so we can say that confronting is done and the temperature of the debate is very low there. And then finally, informing. So informing, in other words, giving advice, giving the client information, all of those kind of activities are discouraged within coaching. However, there is some evidence of debate, plenty of debate, you could say. Firstly, to do with coaching in a business context. So there are people such as Hofstein, for example, and others who said that in certain business contexts, such as a career in extremis, so when someone's been promoted too quickly and they have to fix the problem very fast, or I'm just having a look here because it's to remember the list, organizations in crisis, and there were 5 in total, that you need a fast result. There's no time to build relationship, which is often seen as the key to successful coaching. And you have to get in there and you have to do some informing and sharing information and so on. So they argued that. Then there was another study by Wood in 2015, and he put forward what he called seeding, which is kind of comes from the chemistry environment where you put a dissolved salt into or salt into a saturated solution, which then causes that solution to crystallize around that salt element. And so using that, he said, when the coach drops in a perspective on something, that enables the client to crystallize and make meaning of an issue around that perspective that the coach has offered. He called that seeding. And he did some research on that, and he found that it was very effective in terms of producing coaching results and appreciated by the clients. And so those are 2 examples, and there were more, of the evidence of debate. The other important thing about informing, as I've said, is that it wasn't always the case. In the early days of coaching, it was quite acceptable to offer information, and then it was the attempt to commercialize, according to some authors, Fisher and others, the attempts to commercialize coaching and therefore differentiate it that led to this thing of not ever informing. And it has evolved without strong evidence. So then we can see that that one is strongly in question, excuse me, and the level of debate is quite heated. So that was where we got to in terms of the research, and then the literature study, and then we moved into designing the research, and I'll just give you a high level there. Just important for those who are interested in the academic formalities of that. So we used a qualitative, interpretive, phenomenological approach. It was purposive sampling, which shows 10 executive coaches who met certain criteria. So they needed to have a recognized coaching qualification. They needed at least 10 years experience, at least 60% of that with senior leaders. We did semi-structured interviews followed by a thematic analysis and adopted strategies to ensure trustworthiness. In other words, my supervisor saying, "Now, Neil, this is not about the ICF, okay?" and reminding me. So the semi-structured interviews, just to describe how that went, because this is important, is so I first gave a high-level positioning statement of the directive versus non-directive debate, as I did earlier, defined those terms, and then I asked the coaches to provide a recent example of when they used the directive approach. So it was very broad. Give an example of when you have done so recently, and then talk about how, after they had done that, I asked how they introduced it and how the client responded, and then repeated that. So I got 2 examples from each coach. Then I asked what prompted the more directive approach. So what did they see or what happened that led them to make that choice? And then thirdly, I showed them those 3 categories, the confronting, prescribing, and informing, and asked them to estimate how frequently they use that across their coaching practice. So that was how the interviews went. And now I'll move into the findings. So what did we actually find there? So here we have prescribing interventions were avoided by the coaches. 9 out of 10 of them said they do not use prescribing. So literally, and a lot of this came up in that last section, when they were given the 3 categories. I don't believe in prescribing. I can't think of anything prescriptive. Another one said, I invite clients to do something. I never say you have to, you need to, you must. I invite you. The one coach, however, did recognize that sometimes when the client is paying, you end up prescribing. And my sense is that, yes, there's probably more of that happening than we realize. In fact, one of the Hans studies found that coaches are more directive. Coach clients reported their coaches being more directive than the coaches perceive themselves to be. So it happens even more than we realize. In terms of confronting, so confronting interventions were used carefully and were applied uniquely. So remember, confronting is pretty much accepted within coaching, and yet it was not the most it was used, but very carefully. So one coach said, I do it, but I do it very gently. They don't even know I'm challenging them. Or another one, and then another one said, I love challenging, is a space I play in a lot. Another one, I would be very cautious. So they used it in very different ways, but all 10 were, agreed that they use confronting interventions in the form of challenging. In fact, in first, they needed to be told that it includes challenging, and then they were comfortable with that category. Then informing. So here's the interesting piece. This is where the debate is. All 10 coaches willingly and regularly used informing interventions. Some of the quotes were, I don't think advice is the worst I would use. I offer frameworks and models. Informing comes into it. And then one said, most of my coaching happens in informing interventions. So this was the interesting piece. And we can see this is where the debate is, and this is where it's happening, is that coaches are working differently from what the theory suggests, in that all of them are using. And the important piece here is that all of this was reported spontaneously. So when I asked that first question, give me an example of a directive, they started talking. All their examples were of informing interventions. So it was a significant finding in terms of what came out there. So maybe we can just go into that and have a look at what were those informing interventions that they used. So the first one was introducing frameworks, models, tools, or techniques. So 8 out of 10 coaches, when they described what they did, we then pulled that into the theme of frameworks, tools, or techniques. So that might be like a Johari window, or it could be an emotional wheel, or some other kind of a framework, communication framework that the coach introduces to the clients, and then the client evaluates that and decides how to work with that. So that was the one informing intervention. The next one is sharing resources for parallel learning. So that would be something like a quote, a text, an audio, a video, a book that was suggested by the coach. So this is specific. They didn't say, do you think it would be valuable to go and explore and look for something? They gave them the piece. Here's a video. Here's a book. Maybe you want to use this because it relates to the theme we're talking about. So 5 out of 10 coaches reported doing that spontaneously. This was just their spontaneous reporting. Providing linguistic distinctions. I mentioned that earlier under ontological coaching. So 4 out of 10 provided linguistic distinctions, which is a very particular term that comes out of ontological coaching. And then mentoring. Sometimes there's a need to mentor, some of the coaches said, and that came up 4 times out of 10. Some were just straightforward. Sometimes I just give advice because there's no time. The one coach was very explicit about that. There's a quote here that says, I will say, this is a straight up advice piece, and here it is. Boom. And so those are the informing interventions that were used. So then we come to how executive coaches use a more directive approach when coaching. The interesting thing was that the coaches always prioritized the facilitative style, and they used a non-directive framing to deliver the directive piece. So, and in particular, they used the word offer. So again, in those descriptions that they were giving up front, spontaneously used the word offer 7 out of 10 times. For example, so a person was describing what they were doing, and the quote goes, so then I said, well, would it be okay if I offer an interpretation? And so another coach, I certainly offer frameworks and models. So the offering was specifically designed to do what DeHaan and Nielsen pointed to earlier, which was to give the client the choice whether to work with it or not. So even in giving the book or the YouTube reference, it was, I offer this, but not forcing them to use it. So it was suggesting the piece, but doing it in a non-directive way. Gaining permission. So when I asked the question at the end, which of these approaches, then they brought up gaining permission. I asked permission. Most of them said, I never, I use the word permission a lot. I ask permission if I want to introduce a tool. And yeah, those were some of the quotes for that. And then the other one was being explicit when switching to mentoring. So every time when they were going to move into mentoring, whether it was by request or at their suggestion, they would be explicit, okay, I'm now no longer coaching and I'm moving to mentoring. So those were the non-directive framings for the directive approaches. And then the coaches balanced that with a willingness and readiness to shift their approach in response to the coachee. And that brings us to objective 3, which is why did they do that? What is the rationale? So the first one was, we defined that as the coachee has reached their awareness horizon. So they were unable to gain a perspective or shift their perspective on their own, given their current resources at the time. And quotes there were, if I can see the person is stuck, I'll give them 1 or 2 chances to find those answers, and then I'll offer to share some insights with them. So again, there's the emphasis first on the facilitative, giving them 1 or 2 chances, and then seeing that the coach is stuck in response to the coachee is stuck in response to that, moving to the more directive approach. One of the ontological coaches said, in my approach, you cannot see what you don't have language for. That's a very ontological concept. So I'll offer some language distinctions that help them to see something that before was not clear. And then one person said, what is the value of continuing along a line of questioning if it's not going to produce a result? I mean, the client would literally need to be another person to be able to get there. So that was the extent of it. And 8 out of 10 coaches raised this as a reason why they would move to a directive approach. The next one was perceived expectations and actual requests from the client. So that was when I mentioned earlier that the coach is not able to use I keep getting it, when the coachee is not able to use the coach as a resource. And here it was the coach recognizing that the coachee is asking that, and so they allowed themselves to be used as that resource. So we had some coaches saying, I've heard clients say, I'm tired of always just being questioned. Sometimes I want some sort of meat to chew on. So sometimes there was a perceived expectation of a client, well, I'm paying, so shouldn't you be doing that? And other times it was very explicit. And one client even said, I'm paying for it, so can I ask for what I want, when he was told he can't, get input from the coach. And coaches were further influenced in their choice by their own background and training. So what we found there is that people who had a similar background were able to understand their client's context and feed into that. Ontological coaches were more likely to give the distinction, so their training had that influence. And someone who had training in communication skill was more likely to mentor in that skill when it became necessary, although they would then say, I'm changing into mentoring mode now. And the other part was years of coaching experience. So as coaches coached for longer, they were more likely to become directive, which is interesting because if you look at the MCC criteria on the ICF, which is the more experienced level, they expect you to become less directive, which is why I think many people find that so much at odds with how they coach and practice. And then we get the sponsor context. So the fact that it happens that there's the corporate sponsor is allowed to have input and deserves feedback, sometimes that required a directive approach, either to get the job done more quickly or because specific tools were needed or specific outcomes were needed. However, that wasn't as big a factor, interestingly, as the other things, the coach being stuck, the perceived expectations, the background and training. The sponsor context was the least reported of the influencing factors. And by the way, as we're going through this, please drop your questions into the chat so that Elaine will share them with me and we'll start answering them shortly. We're just getting into some of the questions now and sort of interpreting that. And I'm happy to address any questions or comments that you have, if you feed them into the chat there. Another factor under the sponsor context was the time factor. So often the coaching wasn't supported by sufficient time made available or budget. And so literally it was done in 30-minute bursts and things like, and so that was reported sometimes that the amount of time was very limited, which is questionable whether coaching can happen like that, whether that's even coaching. But one of the, it did come up in from one of the respondents. Okay, so
Neil, so I see at the moment there aren't any questions in the chat, but yeah, thank you all for listening and engaging so far. If you do have any questions or thoughts, please do feel free to pop those in the chat. If you have any questions about the methodology or Neil's findings or how it applies to your own work and practice, we welcome all input.
Right. Thanks, Elaine. So yeah, in terms of the discussion points, and please continue to drop in the questions. I'll carry on with some summary discussion points here, and I'll pose them in the form of questions, coaching questions. And so the first one is around the evidence piece. So we could say that coaching practice may be misaligned with the espoused theory about what makes coaching work, and that it's more about what makes coaching different than what makes coaching work. So the question I would ask there is, what if coaching theory was based on evidence? And if you have any comments on that, you're welcome to drop that into the chat as well. But I think this is one of the key questions that is being asked now. So one thing I learned through the process, that in the academic world, it's kind of accepted that coaching works, that it's effective. It's sort of, there's enough evidence out there that is accepted that coaching is effective in terms of what it intends to do. And the question now has become, how does it work? What are the, by what means does it work? And so we're starting to look much more at that evidence in terms of, what makes coaching work, not just what makes coaching different. However, there's quite a mismatch between the academic and non-academic world in that field, which happens in other areas too. And so getting those two pieces, the coaching schools and accreditation bodies, talking to the academic bodies and agreeing on a way forward, that also seems to be a bit of a challenge. Next one, in what way should coachee interests be considered in the development of that theory? So we could say that coachee interests are not, because of those expectations and requests, that and the apparent benefits to coaching clients. So in my study, one of the things that I didn't report officially, but all of them said that the coachees expressed gratitude and said that they were working with a tool which was self-directed learning, but we weren't examining that as an outcome. So I didn't put it into the report, but all of them reflected positive learning results, although that wasn't tested. So that would be an interesting piece to test if someone is interested in doing a follow-up study, is, what do the actual clients say about that? Although Dehaan has done some work on that. And so the other interesting thing is, though, that clients are more interested in the outcomes than the coaching process. So for example, switching to mentoring, being explicit about switching to mentoring, that really doesn't mean much to the client, except that you're setting up their expectations that you're going to answer all their questions. So probably you do it to avoid that scenario, and from an ethical point of view, keep things in line. But the coachee doesn't really have a concern about that. Okay, I'm seeing something. What are the dangers when coaches give advice in a business context and it's wrong? I guess, that would be something. Yeah, I can't imagine coaches wanting to do that. And I would hope that there's strong terms and conditions in place for that, because if you're going in as a consultant, you're certainly going to have that protection. So I would be very concerned about that one in terms of giving actual business advice. So, yeah. Okay. So then we get to client expectations and requests. And the counterpoint to the last question is, because the client is asking, does that mean that the coach should respond with a more directive approach? Because there is an argument that a more skilled coach would lead them on a facilitative, non-directive journey, still continuing to coach in that very facilitative style and get them to answer their question. That is what the MCC likes to believe about itself and what sort of the idealistic version of coaching is. And there are some people who make those claims in the literature. Parslow and Ray is one from 2000 who said the faster a coach moves to a facilitative approach, the faster there will be performance improvements in the coachee. And so there is definitely that argument. And so we could say, in what way should coaches respond to client expectations and requests? Should they continue coaching or should they respond to them? And I think generally the findings, as we've seen, is that coaches really do try to lean on the facilitative side. They do try as much as possible. There was one study, recent study, 2023, by Fisher and others, who found that if there's a strong if the coach has a similar business background to the person they're coaching, that it can improve the relationship, which is important for coaching. But in those instances, specifically because they shared the business background, the coaches were more careful to not allow that to come forward without permission, and they would, specifically actively try to avoid bringing their experience into the coaching. So there's this strong awareness that one should not do that. So it seems that coaches are self-regulating very effectively in that area, for the most part. And I may be biased. Then another question, what case might there be for prescribing interventions? So although we found that clients have found value in receiving input when they feel free to accept or reject it, and that aligns with self-determination theory, there is a case for prescribing interventions. For example, like in completing the adult learning cycle, one needs to reflect on the exercise that one has done. So how does that reflection happen? In my training as a coach, we were taught to do that first. Like, have you done what you said you would do? What is your learning out of that? That was very prescriptive. And I would say that I still most often do that, although I found in the research that most coaches are not. They will give the client the book, the exercise, the YouTube, and then they won't ask whether they watched it. They won't ask what learning they gained from it. And I had a big question mark about whether that's leaving, a lot on the table as against embedding that learning by getting that reflection. And also as a coach, understanding what are you doing? Is it effective? And is the client's change related to that insight, or is it something else that caused them to make that change in their behavior? As from a coaching curiosity point of view, I'm always interested in those things. So I would imagine that that's one case for prescribing interventions. And in terms of having to deliver certain results by a certain time, another thing that I like to do is midway gather evidence of progress, and that is a prescriptive intervention as well. It's like saying, okay, we're going to do this today, and we're going to find out where you're at. So that's an open question as well. And then what freedom should coaches have to shift their approach in response to client needs? So Heron and DeHaan, Heron's definition was that a valid intervention is one where the coach moves between all of those categories according to the client needs and where the client's progress in the process. And DeHaan supported that idea. And so again, that's where the evidence sits, and then the espoused coaching theory as taught by the training schools and held up by the accreditation bodies is to say that we should not be so flexible.
Neil, there is a question in the chat from Neville.
Okay.
He said, "Great research, Neil. As you said, we know coaching works. I'm very curious about how coaching works. Despite my many years of coaching, it still feels like a magical process. I'm constantly astounded at the shifts in my clients. Maybe more of a comment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is that magic that happens, and I sometimes wonder whether, I sat with that question: is do we see coaching as a sort of a magical process? And when I was going through the MCC process, it kind of felt like, yes, they expect it to be that, and they acknowledge it. They say it might take you 20 recordings to get one that works. Well, what happens in those other 19 sessions? Sometimes it's quite, prosaic, and is the attempt to say elicit that emotional response out of the client, which some of those accreditation processes want you to do, whose agenda is that if the client is looking for a practical solution? So is it sometimes also a mundane process, and should we allow for that as well? And can some simple informing kind of work with that? So I think for me, there's an element of both and certainly I do agree that there is that magic that happens in coaching when you get the client that's capable of insight and you can work in those spaces. And perhaps it's a coaching skill thing. I'm happy to be challenged on that as well. And coaching habits. We do get into habits as well. And on my MCC journey, I think I recognize that too, as yes, I've definitely got into some habits that I learned to shift. And so this question remains open. And then what part should coach training schools and accreditation bodies play in granting that freedom to the coaches? So in terms of the theoretical implications, could we say that coaching needs to focus more on the evidence, and that coach training schools and coach accreditation bodies should be aligning more with the evidence of what coaching works, not just the ideas of what makes coaching different? And that would be one of the implications of the study that I put forward. So those are the challenges that I would offer, and I'm not sure that there are any more questions coming through.
Hilton's got his hand up.
Okay, Hilton.
Thanks, Neil. I don't know if this is really a question, but more of a kind of comment. The world of psychotherapy for many years agonized over the same issue about, what works, what doesn't work. Many meta-analyses were done, comparing different epistemologies with each other. And the one thing they found for sure that was, if you just went to a friend or a colleague or something and got help, it was less effective than if you went to a professional. So, I think that thing was settled. If you went to someone who knew how to facilitate a conversation, that was going to work, was more likely to work than just going to a lay person. And you rightly point out, Dahan and them have done lots of meta-analyses on the effectiveness of coaching. But the debate in psychotherapy evened out the conversation around that one epistemology is better than another. So whether you're directive or facilitative, and in the world of psychotherapy, whether you're psychodynamic or behaviorist or solution-focused or constructionist, there didn't seem to be any difference between the underlying epistemology, but what seemed to make a difference was the relationship between the therapist and the client, or the coach and the coachee. Those things made a big difference. The credibility of the coach and the ability to facilitate a conversation made a big difference. So, if we're trying to, now I would imagine that the findings are going to be very similar across those two worlds, that epistemologies are not really that important. But what is important is the relationship between the coach and the person, and that the coach being credible and, facilitating conversations in a way that the coachee feels that this is someone I can trust and that they're offering something and that it's useful and that it's tentative and that they don't understand my world fully, but they understand it enough to offer something that is worth trying, and it's a departure point for a conversation and not a final solution. All those kind of things I think play into it. And my sense is that coaching will land up in that place, that, you know, the things that, I don't know, ICF and are on about, which is a very prescriptive way of doing coaching, is probably the least important predictor of effective coaching. Much more predictive is how you form a relationship and work with the client in a facilitative way. So I think I think that we'll probably largely agree on that stuff, and that a mix of epistemologies is probably going to help.
Absolutely. Thanks, Hilton.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I do recall along the journey that the evidence is so far is that the relationship is the most important element of the coaching. And if I remember correctly, that was within coaching, not borrowing from the therapy field. So agreed there. And yeah, I would imagine. So one thing that came up for me that I questioned around this was all of the coaches expressed their frustration at having to, if any of them had considered the accreditation journey, they either were like at the MCC level, they either were, I'm not going to do it, or I'm going to do it as a tick box exercise. And if you think about coaching relating to authenticity and way of being, and there's something fundamental at the heart, because, the ICF is the biggest accreditation body. There's something fundamental there that isn't aligned. So I think that is important, and then that feeds into the coach training schools, and effectively, so what ends up happening, I think, and this was expressed in some of the people that feel guilty coaching the way they do. So you've got a coach who's doing stuff that's working, but they feel guilty for it, or they're trying so hard to not do something that they become less effective. They're focusing more on their performance.
Right.
So those were two things that came up to that I thought would be practical implications. Was if coaches could just be allowed to work in the space, they could actually be more effective just for that reason alone. And it would be more authentic in terms of what coaching strives to be. It would be more aligned with coaching striving to be about authenticity.
Right.
Neil, we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
Okay, the first one is from Zahir. I agree that at times it's necessary to be directive, but this should not be a default, but rather only used when necessary. Ultimately, the client should be at the center, and a coach should meet them at what they require. The line to draw is that the coach doesn't switch to this mode because of what the coach needs, but it should be what the client needs.
100% Zahir. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing is the statement there about meeting the client where they're at. So the key is, if you're going to introduce information, firstly getting permission, checking that it's the right thing, and checking how the client receives it and what they're going to do with it, rather than assuming any of that. And that would be the key piece for me, is making sure that you're 100% with the client in terms of how they're receiving the information. And again, as we saw, doing that as a last resort. Absolutely.
Great, thank you. And Keegan asked, what should happen if a client would benefit most from a directive coaching approach, but the coach is not comfortable or skilled in delivering that style? Should the coach adapt their approach to suit the client's needs, even if not comfortable to do so? Or would it be more appropriate to refer the client to another coach who is better aligned with that coaching style?
In the beginning, with the client is wanting a more directive style. Yeah.
Yes, if a client would benefit from a more directive coaching approach.
Yeah. Possibly, I think it probably speaks to Hilton's point about the relationship and what the coach can provide. So I think if the coachee if that doesn't give the coachee what they need or give them confidence in the coach, then yes, that probably would be, I imagine, would be a viable solution, is to refer them to another coach who can do that and is willing to do that. I don't know if anybody else has a comment on that.
Nothing in the chat at the moment.
I think,
Okay.
Neil, that
Good.
often clients don't know what they don't know, to Keegan's point. Perhaps it just shows up as a disconnect or not feeling, the words chemistry with the coach, but maybe it's more around what's been spoken of here, which is my expectation. Often people think it's going to be mentorship or they think it's going to be consulting, and it ends up being maybe just a little less than what they hoped for.
Yeah, yeah.
Great. I think then no more questions, Elaine?
No, no more questions.
Wonderful. I'll be very directive and say, thank you, Neil. This has been an amazing session. Well done for the research and for putting in all your effort and time to share your knowledge so generously. As always, we always appreciate your learning spirit. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you for the opportunity, Colleen. And thanks, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil.
Bye-bye.